Hello and welcome to this episode of the Existentialist Talks Podcast, where we talk about different topics in existentialism each 2 weeks. Today we're joined by Laurence to discuss the teleological suspension of the ethical, the use of the individual, truth, and more in Kierkegaard's philosophy. Kierkegaard is one of the leading scholars to the field of existentialism, and we can't wait to have this discussion with you. Laurence, how are you?
I'm all right.
Wonderful. The first thing we should start off is the idea of the teleological suspension of the ethical. This is an idea found within his book, The Fear and Trembling, where he discusses the sacrifice of Isaac and talks about how the sacrifice of Isaac kind of demonstrates the mode of the teleological suspension of the ethical, where the individual moves beyond the universal, moves beyond the ethical rule. Can you perhaps start us off with delving into perhaps the exact arguments that he provides behind the teleological suspension of the ethical?
So the way that Kierkegaard sort of lays out this whole idea of the teleological suspension of the ethical is he lays it out in a problema, effectively. He asks a problem. He says, is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? If there isn't a teleological suspension of the ethical, then Abraham is lost. He has lost faith, and everything is sort of questionable about the entire story, effectively. But if there is a teleological suspension of the ethical, and this means that Abraham is able to sort of be justified, but in a different sense, not in an ethical sense, primarily because the whole point of the teleological suspension of the ethical, as you said, is this idea that the individual supersedes the universal. And what Kierkegaard means by this is that the universal represents a sort of ethical duties and laws. So we can go back to Kant's categorical imperative for that. We can go to people like Hegel, who proposed the idea of the Stilllichkeit, which Kierkegaard does mention specifically in Fear and Trembling. And so with that, what are these sort of things? These are duties, these are moral laws, these are social laws, these are objective laws. And what happens in Genesis 22, as we've discussed in the previous episode, is this idea that the father and the son are sort of broken apart. That duty, that bond between father and son is broken apart by a divine command. And effectively what Kierkegaard wants to argue here is that Abraham, in this situation, has a teleological suspension of the ethical. Teleological in that it is for an end. The ethical is suspended. It is no longer sort of present to the story. And the sort of objection from the father-son bond is lost in that regard. This means that we might have to have a bit of an interesting discussion about what does this mean, and especially in terms of ethics, in that does this mean, for example, that religious violence can be justified? That because I said God has justified me in blowing up a whole bunch of people, I've got a teleological suspension of the ethical. But Kierkegaard sort of has a way out for this, and it's through his concept of faith. And it's this idea that faith, which occurs within the individual, occurs a source of risk, a leap, as it were. And that this sort of leap is not something which is just like, God told me to do it, therefore this. Rather, it's something which is a bit more fundamental. It has to do with the way one lives their life and the way one sort of, what kind of spheres, what kind of decisions that they make. It's that either or sort of mentality that Kierkegaard points out in his first philosophical work. And effectively, the central idea here is that faith, when understood in the Kierkegaardian sense, has the ability to teleologically suspend the ethical, and that from there Abraham is justified in doing what he did and placing his trust in God, and ultimately having the good come out of it, with the angel coming down to say to Abraham.
I was wondering, how does divine command theory, and perhaps this is a question about the metaethics, the metaphysics of the teleological suspension of the ethical, because what it seems to me is that given a conception of faith, and perhaps we could develop his conception of faith a bit later on in this episode, but there's this idea that perhaps Christ gives us the ethical law. The universal is part of God, and therefore God himself has the power to break it if and when he so wishes. I guess that would be the divine command theory reading of the Abraham story. Now, analogically, or at least based on the results of the analysis of the situation, you could say, well, okay, it seems like the conclusions and the practicality of how one would respond to the Kierkegaardian kind of teleological suspension of the ethical and the divine command theory would be kind of the same in the sense of, well, all right, we have a time where God's commands to some person would transcend the universal ethical law because the divine commands, the universal ethical law in the first place was a result of divine commands. And that might be a perspective that some person takes towards the Abrahamic story. I was wondering whether you think Kierkegaard, I guess, his distinction of the teleological suspension of the ethical is perhaps a bit more nuanced than that, I guess, presented by the divine command theorist. Not saying the divine command theorist is not nuanced, but is it perhaps of a different nature?
I think it's of a completely different nature, because the question that we're asking here is not a question of meta-ethics or ethics. That is, was it right for Abraham to do this? For Kierkegaard, the answer is a very big, resounding no. So you might say the conclusions are the same, but actually, if you really think about it, the conclusions aren't the same. For the divine command theorist, Abraham is right in doing what he did. In all of the entire story, he is right because God told him to do so, right? According to divine command. But under Kierkegaard's view, Abraham is wrong. He is wrong ethically, and he's wrong before God, as he says in the law, that everyone's wrong before God. And this is the key difference between a divine command theorist and Kierkegaard. See, the divine command theorist wants to make the ethical case. He is right to do these things. Kierkegaard is a bit different. He wants to say that Abraham is wrong ethically in all of the things that he's done with regards to killing his son. But the main but here is that what faith has done is has put him sort of outside of the question. When Kierkegaard says that the individual is put higher than the universal, what he means there is that the whole question about ethics sort of just becomes kind of irrelevant about whether this is right or wrong. Clearly, in the ethical world, this is wrong. But what Kierkegaard puts there is that Abraham is sort of outside of that sort of sphere, and that what happens in that sort of other sphere, what we might call the religious sphere, is not a question of ethics, but a question of faith. And that what Abraham is doing is wrong. He knows what he's doing is wrong. He should not be killing his son. But through faith, he understands that in order to follow God, and in order to sort of trust in him, what some Jewish scholars like Berkowitz sort of lay upon that focus on that idea of trust. What Abraham is doing there is he is hoping that God will make sure that this ends up right in the end, and that's sort of what happens, right? And what Kierkegaard wants to say to us is that not necessarily that. I mean, this is the misinterpretation, right? The misinterpretation is to view Kierkegaard as a divine command theorist. But if you view Kierkegaard as a divine command theorist, you're following in the exact thing he wants to deny, which is the ethical itself, the whole thing, the whole sort of systems. He uses in his example contemporary concepts, Hegel's Stelligkeit and Kant's categorical imperative. But what he wants to do is move beyond that sort of role. And you make an interesting point about the sort of God can break the ethical law and God can do these things. Now, this is where it's a bit interesting to view Kierkegaard's theology here, and why we might be a bit more suspicious of that. Because we might be able to think, okay, Kierkegaard clearly, or if he's not Kantian, or if he's not if he's not a divine command theorist, then he might as well be like a Cartesian. This idea of this unlimited omnipotence. And the thing is, Kierkegaard, what he does there is he provides not much answers to that kind of question. In many ways, he seems to be quite uninterested in answering the question: what is the nature of God's omnipotence? What does he do to do? Is he right? Is he right to command the whole thing? For Kierkegaard, he's very much focused on the reception of God in the individual, and he's very much interested in that kind of aspect. So in many ways, if we want to sort of understand what Kierkegaard's project is in Fear and Trembling, we have to also say what he's not doing. Namely, he's not making a work on ethics. He's not making a work of pure sort of philosophy of religion, as it were. In many ways, it's an existentialist work. It's a work which tries to deal with existence and how we deal with the absurd, what he calls this sort of strength of the absurd in Abraham. God's command is absurd. And how do we deal with the question of dealing with that and in the social and in a moral context? And that's the key distinction there. Kierkegaard is moving past this almost, in a way, some people have even described as an anti-metaphysical approach. I believe Claire Carlyle and some others have sort of moved towards this idea of Kierkegaard being anti-metaphysical. I'm not sure how far I follow with that. That's for a different video, but there are some people in scholarship who are thinking, well, Kierkegaard's entire sort of project here is to just not really care about those kinds of original philosophical questions about God, whether it's right or wrong to do these things, or whether divine command theory is true, but rather how does the individual react and what are the sort of motions that occur there. And that's why he states it. Maybe even it's not even right to say he has an argument for the teleological suspension of the ethical. He just sort of says it's a thing, it's a problem, and it's the argument there relates not to establishing it as a sort of philosophical fact, but rather as an expression of the experience that Abraham and many others have with the struggles with perhaps with God's command, effectively.
Developing upon this, and I think we should move on to talk a bit more about, I guess, the role of faith itself here. And there's this beautiful quote which says, faith is precisely this paradox that the single individual as a particular is higher than the universal and is justified over it. And I guess we've been talking a bit about, well, I guess the conclusions of how faith by its very nature is that which, I guess, brings us beyond, not necessarily kind of stops us from transgressing the law, but rather brings us beyond the law in some sense. And I think one interesting element of Kierkegaard's philosophy is that role of faith as kind of that demarcating kind of principle between the individual as an individual and the community or the group as the group. And of course, we'll talk a bit more about this later on in this analysis, where we're going to talk about the crowd and truth and how those two ideas interact with each other. But nonetheless, I do think that this idea of and I guess tying this even further is the one who gives up the universal in order to grasp something still higher that is not the universal. That kind of that movement towards that which is not the universal is something which is very important to keep in mind. And perhaps let's now ask the question, which is very important. Is like, what do you think is the very essence of faith, and also how does faith kind of be distinguished between different faith backgrounds, especially in a world where we talk about faith dialogues?
That's a very big question. The first thing that I'd probably say to that is that word paradox, right? For Kierkegaard, the essence of faith is not straightforward, right? It isn't something which is, in a way, susceptible to our analysis. And for many philosophers, in many ways, like people, this is why people want to say that Kierkegaard's not really a philosopher. If he's not interested in finding the necessary sufficient conditions for what makes someone faithful, then what the hell is he doing? Well, what he's actually doing in this situation is he's trying to touch upon the sort of deep interiority, the deep sort of inner human life and its connection to the divine. And it's very interesting that you mentioned this sort of pluralism. Now, for Kierkegaard, he seems to be aware of what other religions are doing. But for him, he is entirely concerned with the Christian faith. And this is where you have this sort of advantage of the Christian faith. For Kierkegaard, he considers mainly two kinds of religions primarily in his works: paganism and Christianity. Very sort of paralleling someone like Nietzsche, who does very similar things, but comes out with very different sorts of conclusions. And for Kierkegaard, when he's thinking about paganism, he's thinking its advantages are that, well, it's able to understand a lot of the sensory things. It's able to understand a lot of the aesthetic, sort of immediate things that come to one's experience. And in many ways, it's able to understand even ethical concepts. Someone like Plato is able to develop very strong ethical systems, someone like Aristotle as well. But it isn't able to comprehend this idea of the spirit and the self as in dialectic with one another, in imbalance, and precisely using this word that later is used by Anticlimacus, who's meant to be an author of the highest degree of faith, as it were, this role of despair. And for the Christian has this advantage in their faith, in that they know what is despair, and that they know the tool to solve it. And despair for Kierkegaard, to put it very sort of roughly, it is a bit difficult sometimes to pass precisely what he means when in the Sickness Unto Death. Sometimes, so he moves on to talk about very different types of despair: objective, subjective, and the despair over the good, despair over evil. So he talks about these very distinct types of despair, but the main sort of focus of it in Sickness Unto Death is this idea of the imbalance or the sort of problems of the dialectic between sort of the mind and the body. Now, once again, what he means by mind and body is not the sort of thing that people in philosophy generally think about, which is that there's a thinking substance and then there's a material substance, and how do they interact? Rather, what he's thinking about is this, and I mean, in a way, you can sort of take it literally and sort of try and analyze that from that perspective. But what's even more interesting, actually, is this idea of the sort of finite, the parts of us which always change. Maybe my hair, in a way, sort of paralleling that material sort of psychical sort of distinction, versus something that is immutable and eternal and that will live on forever. And for Kierkegaard, he conceives us very much taking on from Augustine's concept of human beings are a mean between man and between angel and beast. That there's a part to us which is eternal and able to be an immutable. Our soul, he uses that word, and the other part which is changeable. Our bodies, our sort of emotions, our sensitivities, our aesthetic preferences, those can change. And effectively, his idea there of Christian faith is that we understand how that can cause a bit of problems, and we know the solution, which is for him Christ, and for us Christians, so too will be Christ. The pagans, unfortunately, are different in that some of them aren't aware, and so they just live in despair without even knowing it. And other people who are aware, they did live in despair, but they don't accept Christ. So they can't solve it.
I think that's a fascinating aspect, and perhaps before we move on to talk about the crowd and the truth, and I know this is very interesting, but I think in light of time, and we should move on to the next topic. Before we do so, I'll read you a quote from the end of Fear and Trembling, which says, "The tragic hero resigns himself to express the universal. The knight of faith resigns the universal to become the single individual." What do you think that this quote means? Because I guess when I'm reading it, I have the intuition that what it's saying is the knight of faith is the one which, through his faith, is able to say, well, the single individual, my individuality, is that which brings me beyond this realm of saying I am under the ethical law, but allows for one to act in a pure, I guess, faith-based way. Whereas on the contrary, the tragic hero is someone who says, well, I have that picture of the Greek kind of gods in some sense, or the Greek heroes, where they're like, I am but one who is struggling by fate, and that fate condemns me, and I must just allow that to be the case, and I will suffer because of it. And I do think at the start of Fear and Trembling, if I remember correctly, he does use that example of the Greek heroes. I can't remember exactly which one of them. It's been a while since I've read it, but there is that element of, I guess, that tragedy which comes from accepting the almost the futility or the almost impending doom of the universal. I was wondering what's your kind of take on that and how that kind of works together.
Okay, so first, before we need to talk about the outcomes of that statement, first we need to talk about two terms that are used here. So we've discussed the universal, now let's talk about the tragic hero and the knight of faith just quickly, and then we can get onto that. So the tragic hero for Kierkegaard and he uses the example of someone like Agamemnon and Iphigenia, and Jephthah and his daughter. And effectively, the tragic hero is someone who resigns himself. So that means he gives up everything. This is, as it were, the knight of infinite resignation that he describes, someone who accepts things as they are, and yet does not make the full leap. He's not able to make that full leap of faith. So he describes the analogy he uses is like two like ballerinas. One, the knight of infinite resignation, or the tragic hero, is someone who like makes the leap but falls down flat. The main reason why is because they still are bound by the sort of ethical laws that bind them. So Agamemnon, for example, is punished for killing Iphigenia because he didn't act out of faith. He acted out because he felt that he needed to, one cynically might say, support his own needs. Maybe if you're utilitarian, you might say, oh yes, he needed to justify all of Greece who had been wronged by Paris, so it was right for him to do so. There are many different ways you might see Iphigenia's thing as particularly unethical, but in fact, on the wide sense, he was sacrificing his own daughter for the sake of his nation, for the sake of his society. So this is the sort of case that he wants to say. This is someone who's making a leap but failing to stick the landing effectively. And the reason he does that is because he hasn't actually suspended the ethical. He's still punished for that crime. And he's punished by his wife Clytemnestra cheating on him and killing him. And that's why it's a tragedy, because instead of the sort of sacrifice acting as an example of faith, it in fact becomes an example of sin, an example of a violation of ethics for a different sort of situation. So this is why the sort of tragic hero resolves back into the universal and is punished by the universal for breaking its laws, and that's what happened to Agamemnon. Whereas the knight of faith, like Abraham, the knight of faith doesn't lose. Like, even when the knight of faith has lost, they've won because of Christ and their faith in God. And what happens is that, see, Abraham, he almost kills his son, and there are even some sort of stories around it that make it so he really almost killed his son, like even pierces his body. Some other sort of more apocryphal stories speak about that. But for Kierkegaard, he views Abraham as in being this very special situation where he wins in the end. God gives him back everything that he lost, and God does not make him follow through with the horrible deed he's about to do. And the reason that is because he stuck the landing. He has gone through faith. And that's why he becomes a single individual. And when he becomes a single individual, this doesn't mean that he has the sort of free reign to do whatever he wants, in a way. What this means is that actually he is understood. In many ways, Abraham isn't seen as great because of how right he is in what he has done, but he is seen as great in a very paradoxical way as how wrong he is because of what he has done. Because, in a way, he's done he almost done this horrible, wrongful act against his own son. What God has done is he's turned that sort of horrible situation paradoxically into a state of faith, and this is where he becomes a single individual before God, and he becomes much closer than we are to who he is. He becomes much closer to who he is meant to be, as it were, or even meant to be is a bit of a loaded term because it suggests that there's sort of an exterior sort of force making him do that. But in fact, even better, a way to put it even better is that he becomes who he is. So he moves closer towards being. He moves closer towards God, and in that whole motion occurs because of faith, and that's why he resolves to becoming a single individual, whereas someone like Agamemnon resolves to being resolved back into the universal.
I think that's a very interesting aspect that you present here, and perhaps it's time to move on to the idea of the crowd and the truth, because we've talked a bit about faith quite a long time, and perhaps there is this movement which is in line with the Christian, I guess, the Christian interpretation of faith, but also there's a religious aspect of faith in inside the private realm, and there's this idea where where he writes in That Single Individual, an essay of his, where it says, even if all the individuals separately, secretly possessed the truth, were to come into the crowd, untruth would promptly be present there. It's almost this idea that untruth is by definition, or almost by its nature, something which is impossible to be encapsulated when you move beyond the individual. And I wonder how we would, I guess, frame it to our previous discussion, because of course we already have, you put that almost very paradoxical but very interesting idea of, like, he is great in so much as how wrong he is and how much he breaks, I guess, the ethical norm. There is likewise that question of, well, how much of Kierkegaard's movement is a movement towards the faith in the private individual, in the sense that we should not try to, what's the best word for this? We should try to just keep our faith to ourselves and not necessarily create a state religion, because of course Kierkegaard was writing very strongly against the Danish church at the time. I mean, how do these movements tie together?
I will make a first point that Kierkegaard, I don't think, is advocating for a state of quietism. I think it's very clear that he thinks that religion is something that should be spoken of, and God is not some sort of person to just be silent about. So when we talk about private religion, I think we need to be careful with our terms and how we want to approach Kierkegaard's understanding of society. And effectively, what I understand by the crowd is untruth is that we need to possibly read that in the light of, or maybe not in the light of, maybe we should do a bit of a double reading, like we put them together, but we don't view them as fully influencing one another. We put that with philosophical fragments, where Kierkegaard really does delve into the question of what is untruth. And the key thing for Kierkegaard is that in his time, contemporarily, there were so many people discussing religion as something which is sort of a grand, sort of homogeneous blob of human beings who have lost their individuality. So he's particularly thinking about Hegel there when he's discussing religion and the phenomenology, right? Religion becomes this sort of absolute thing which allows us to get closer, this image, as it were, that allows us to get to the concept of absolute knowing. For Kierkegaard, he's not interested in that instrumental view of religion, and in many ways, this can lead him to have some very weird sort of conclusions. And one of those things is the crowd is untruth. And for me, the crowd being untruth can and is related to the question of church and its role in as a community versus individual. But I don't think it's fully there yet. I think it's definitely getting closer towards that part where Kierkegaard very much rejects the state church. And one of the big questions that I don't really know yet is, at what point did Kierkegaard say the state church is irrelevant, we don't need it, or I really don't like it, this is not something that I want to subscribe to. One person might say his rejection of the priesthood in his youth is that moment, but I'm not fully subscribed just yet. But anyway, back to the crowd is untruth. The crowd is untruth is a particular reaction to what happened to him during the Corsair affair, where he was ridiculed in public by a newspaper, and that made him a social pariah. And what he describes in the crowd is untruth is this problem where if you're in this massive crowd and you're just sort of following them, as it were, and in many ways he's sort of definitely prefiguring a lot of what Nietzsche is about to say about the individual being in society and sort of following stuff like a herd. In many ways, Kierkegaard is saying the same thing. He's saying, well, if you're in society and you're trying to ask questions about meaning and trying to get towards being, as it were, from becoming to being, what you'll find in the crowd is not the truth. You won't find being there. Why? Because they aren't you, right? They're different from you, and they all have their own sort of tasks. And he uses this example of the diamond in the middle of the ice lake, right? There's this guy who plunges out of the crowd, and he knows that the ice lake could be thin somewhere. He might fall and crash. There's a risk to this, but he still wants to get that diamond. And what does the crowd do in this situation? They laugh, they jeer, they make pamphlets, they make jokes about him, they create a whole media sort of scandal around him. He's a fool, he's an idiot. Why did he take this risk? For Kierkegaard, in an existential sense, and also in a manner of faith, what this man is doing by himself is very much not private, it's very public, but it is focused within him as a Christian and with him as an individual. In many ways, for Kierkegaard, the whole purpose of being Christian is to become an individual before God. And this is where the question of like the crowd is very important, where the crowd sort of reduces that ability. And this is why it is untruth, because it doesn't get you closer towards Christ. It keeps you apart from it. Now, this is why, like, I think it's a question which definitely prefigures his later anti-ecclesiology, you might call it. So Kierkegaard, the anti-metaphysician, Kierkegaard, the anti-ecclesiologist. But it's not something which I think is directly related just yet. And we should very much see this role as something being public and very much related to his underlying view, which is that Christianity's whole purpose is for creating the individual, making people become who they are, rather than what society tells them they're meant to be.
Yes, I think that idea of the crowd and the effects that has, I guess, existentially and also psychologically on one's mind is something which is very important. But I would like to perhaps push you on the point of, I guess, the idea of crowd being untruth, because I guess when we're thinking about the statement which elaborates the idea of the crowd is untruth, it says, even if all the individuals separately secretly possess the truth and if they came together, the untruth would be present. It's almost, there's this distinction that the moment that everyone has, even if everyone was right, the moment that that realm of truth entered into the public sphere, or not necessarily public sphere, but into a crowd where everyone believes in it, untruth arises. I was wondering, I guess there's the question, and perhaps I'm being pedantic here, but there's the question of, well, is this distinction an epistemic one, such that the way in which we observe and understand the truth has fundamentally changed, such that truth is no longer truth in the strictest sense? Or is it an ontological one, such that the very essence, the ontology, the existence of truth itself has changed, such that it is no longer present within the crowd? And I guess a good example of this, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, wait, no. Well, I want to hear your example first.
Well, I guess my example is not a very good one. I was just thinking about, okay, it was kind of like a Eucharistic one. It's like, does a Protestant who attends a Catholic Mass, they don't understand or they don't recognize that the Eucharist, the real presence is there, but nonetheless, ontologically speaking, the real presence is there. But then I guess ontologically speaking, when was that moment, I guess, just thinking from an ontological sense, if the church was fully a set of Protestants, but nonetheless it was a Catholic priest who did and did the rite properly, and ergo there was a proper, I guess, Eucharistic ceremony, and therefore there is the body of Christ present, that seems to suggest that the ontology has changed, even though the epistemology hasn't changed. So I guess what is the essence of truth in this situation?
Okay, I think I would lean towards the ontological a bit more than the epistemic, but I'm not sure if even ontological is the right way to put it. But I'll attempt. The reason why I don't think it's epistemic is because if it is about knowledge, then we have a bit of a problem here, in that, well, knowledge tends to be quite analyzable. But for Kierkegaard, he doesn't consider truth as this question of an analyzable sort of fact that we can break down into something like a justified true belief, something like that. For Kierkegaard, the truth is not something that belongs to that sort of analysis. Rather, truth is found in an individual, ironically, or maybe unironically. It's found in Christ. And this is the key here. All the individuals who have truth, right, when they come together as a crowd, it's like you end up having this sort of, I don't know how to fully describe it. when it is gone, I think Kierkegaard means that they become focused on one another, and they become focused on, as it were, talking about the truth, but they don't actually get there. And the difficulty in the crowd is when, and this is why it is related to his anti-ecclesiology in the end, isn't it? In that when they come together, and maybe you might call this a church, they begin to sort of lose focus on their own sort of quest towards Christ. And this is the difficulty now, because existentially speaking, this seems to be quite a reasonable sort of understanding, right? Existentially speaking, if everybody sort of like is going towards their own sort of goals, their own sort of existential meaning, trying to find that meaning, whatever that might be, and they come together, then obviously that causes problems, right? But now, theologically speaking, the whole thing then becomes a bit difficult. As you mentioned with the example of the Eucharist, actually, it was very interesting. If you have this whole situation where all of these people who like believe in the truth of the Eucharist, right, or don't believe in it, in a way, if you might say the question is that are people who believe in the truth of the Eucharist come together before the Eucharist, in fact, are in untruth, whereas the people who don't believe in the Eucharist, because they're already in untruth, are in more truth than the people who aren't. A single Protestant who doesn't believe in the Eucharist is further away, is closer to the truth of the Eucharist than a whole group of Catholics, and that seems a bit weird, right? And in a way, this is why I want to sort of distance that sort of discussion away from ecclesiology, and obviously I can't fully like disregard it, because I think what he means in that situation is a bit more existential than religious. However, you're right to point out this problem, right? That Kierkegaard seems to suggest that in any situation, religiously speaking, if you want to get towards Christ, you should be by yourself. But I want to make it clear, though, that when I think he understands what I think he means by himself, by oneself, that one approaches Christ as in like the individual has truth. I think he's more pointing towards. I don't think he's making as radical a claim as maybe I just presented there. I think the position that I would properly take. So I would say that the sort of, I wouldn't say it's a misreading. I think it's actually quite a good reading to view Kierkegaard in the previous way I mentioned. But I think a more charitable reading of him might be to say what he means by the crowd is untruth is that individuals they have a choice to make. They must either choose Christ or abandon him, right? The problem is when you enter into society, when you enter into these social pressures, and when you enter into maybe even things like churches, for example, that can be clouded with many other different kinds of questions, as it were. And that can result in this sort of, once again, the Hegelian homologation, the de-individuating role of the crowd. But Kierkegaard just wants to make a bit of a more calmer point that individuals, really, that's the better word, individuals make these choices by themselves. They are the judge, as it were. Objective truth and all these things exist, but they are the judge of whether or not that meaning is going to be formed and whether or not they are going to try and form that existential meaning, and by that religious sort of relationship with Christ.
Now that we've talked a bit more about the epistemology of the truth, and we've talked a bit about how this interacts, I think we can move on to talk a bit more about the idea of the cowardliness of the crowd, because in some sense they say the crowd is cowardly as it crushes individuality. Being an individual, to stand out is difficult, and also to be an individual is to be a martyr in some sense. There's a few of these different aspects. Your reference to kind of the biographical ideas of the time of that Kierkegaard was writing this and came up with his ideas is a very important one. But also, I do want to, perhaps we could take a step back from existential kind of, I guess, analyzing Kierkegaard and try to apply that to what we see in society today, because I think it's very important that existentialism is a lived out philosophy. It's not just what did Kierkegaard say, but how can I apply Kierkegaard to our lives? And in that sense, I would like to make the argument or the suggestion that perhaps there is this element where the crowd is practically speaking, very, very much an element of untruth, because or just a very cowardly thing. Because if we think about, I guess, Instagram, there's always these kind of movements on Instagram, whatever it is, like Free Palestine or Black Lives Matter, and then you'll see one person posted a black square, and then everyone posts a black square, and everyone falls in. And I'm not saying that, oh, it's cowardly to take part in, because I think a lot of these causes are very virtuous and righteous. But at the same time, I think there's an element where we have to be aware that, I guess, when we're going through life, are we acting based on our individual thought, that the reason why we're doing these actions by supporting Black Lives Matter or doing things is, are we doing those out of the fact that I think it is right, I think it is the case that I must, I want to support this, or is it the case that I'm thinking, well, all right, hold up a second, I'm just doing this because my mate Jack is doing it, or my mate Jim's doing it. Why am I actually doing it? I think that's an important question.
This is actually very true and very pertinent, in fact. I think that Kierkegaard is making a very strong case that if you're going to do something, don't do it because other people said that it was good, right? Even if it may itself be good. Remember, he sort of believes that there's this objective morality, objective truth, as it were, in Christ and God. And this is very, very pertinent, because for Kierkegaard, if you like, let's take these sort of social media examples, right? There are people that do it because they genuinely believe it, and there are people who do it because they need to do it, as it were, to fit into the crowd. And the people that genuinely do it, we might make analogous to the people who are like on the ice, as it were. They're striving for the diamond, they're striving for the truth, as it were. But the people that just sort of stay back and they just say that they like it, in a way, is the people who stay at the sides of the lake, and they sort of, maybe they're not jeering against them, but rather they're sort of silently admiring them and wishing that they could do the same. But because they're in this crowd and they're a bit afraid of making a move, they are sort of content with doing the sort of minimal possible. And I think when it comes to, especially with the internet, it becomes much more easier to hold on to things that are popular and then abandon it as soon as it doesn't become popular, right? And this is the problem, right? And I think a lot of social movements have this difficulty, especially on the internet, of maintaining relevance, because it's so easy. The crowd is like, the internet is the sort of modern representation of the crowd, the whole sort of people talking, going all around with one another, even as we're speaking right now. This is an example of it, right? And what Kierkegaard wants to say is that block your ears from that kind of noise and go with what you believe, and don't do it because it's trendy at the time. Don't do it because it's popular, because that's cowardice. That is untruth itself. Because you don't, in a way, it's untruth very much to yourself. It's even worse. You're lying to yourself, especially if you don't believe it, right? If you don't, or if you're neutral towards it. If you feel so passionate about this thing, then go for it. Be passionate, and you should do it because you believe that right now that black people are being mistreated in America, and so you must go out and do what you must do, instead of just sort of sitting back and shouting online where nothing really happens. In truth, what Kierkegaard is saying is, in a way, is a very good one for the modern age. Is like, sort of get out there and do what you believe to be correct, and not just sit on Instagram and maybe write pamphlets about how nasty this whole thing is, but rather actually go out there and do something with it. Go out and fetch the diamond, even if people ridicule you. And here's the key part, I think, that I almost forgot to miss out, and it's risk, right? The whole point of why this metaphor of the ice lake is so important is because you always have a chance that you're gonna fall. There's a chance, and this can come in two ways, right? One, you might be wrong, right? You might have this belief about something, and you're so like very much for it, and the problem is, oh wait, I'm actually wrong. Like this was a faulty thing. And in a way, you have to be. Some people aren't willing to be wrong. Some people are willing to just sort of say that this is the truth, and they're not willing to accept the possibility that they might be wrong. And because of that, they remain staying at the sides, and they don't want to make a move. And the second part is social rejection, of course. And I think this is very much these two sort of factors are very much related to one another. Social rejection happens because you're wrong, or maybe you're right and all the society is wrong as well. So you have to. So in a way, what's involved in this sort of process of leaving the crowd and going towards the diamond is this very radical acceptance of the fact that you might be wrong and the fact that you'll be ridiculed for this kind of thing. And people are willing, in many ways, to say that they do this. But would they do it? Very much a different question. And Kierkegaard wants to tell us, go out and do it. Go and fetch that diamond. It doesn't matter. If you're wrong, right? You'll fall into the sea. You might freeze and drown. But at least you can say that you're an individual and you approach truth. And then you can fully say that you are, in a way, a martyr.
I think that's a very beautiful way to put it. Now, perhaps the way to finally get to the end of this podcast is to talk about the distinction of the knowledge of God, because that's something which is discussed more particularly in Philosophical Fragments by Kierkegaard. And I think there's this idea of there's two ways to look at it, right? I think there is the kind of his anti-Hegelian criticism to say, well, we do not need God God does not need us for some self-disclosure of spirit, such that God needs humans to know himself. That's something that Kierkegaard is arguing against, and that's an important aspect. And another aspect is the idea of the absolute difference between God and man, that man cannot know God directly, and rather through the absolute paradox, which is the incarnation of Christ, one is able to truly, I guess, appreciate, not directly know God, but actually have the appreciation of God, and that true worship of God, comes from a recognition of the absolute difference, the lowering of oneself in face of the strength of a divine God. I was wondering, I guess, and I know I've set the net quite broad here, but what do you think is the anti-Hegelian, I guess, notion that Kierkegaard is presenting, and also, I guess, in extension after that we could talk a bit more about the absolute difference?
So I think this anti-Hegelian idea I think it's actually a bit easier to put when you understand what Hegel's project is, and to understand to say and then it becomes harder to say, because what is Hegel's project? But in my view, what seems to be argued is that God is, and this is in many ways why the left Hegelians can sort of have their triumph here, is that God is an expression of the human need for knowledge and the human need to know, to reason, and to venture forward. In many ways, so someone like Feuerbach would make the sort of parallel here. So actually, rather Hegel, you say that this is something that shows that God exists. So he is this one who absolutely knows, and and we're all tending towards that kind of absolute knowledge. No, actually, God isn't that. We have just made that up, and that all these things are just expressions of that desire to know and to care and do all those things that Hegel wants us to do. And this is the thing that Kierkegaard really, really, really doesn't like. Kierkegaard already dislikes the idea that individuals, are within this sort of amalgam of knowledge and dialectic. And secondly, he really dislikes this idea that God is dependent upon this dialectic for his existence. And in fact, actually, this whole thing relates to the absolute difference, right? Because for Hegel, right, God is a bit more can be sort of understood, right? Eventually, we can understand him once we get there, right? Once civilization has developed enough and we are in the right historical, idealistic conditions, we will get there. We will understand God, and there we go. We've done it. Ended history. Good job, guys. We can move on to the next whatever task that might be set to us. But for Kierkegaard, he's like, no, that's not true at all. That's not the task. I mean, let alone what is the task of humanity? Like, it's a really big question, Hegel. Number two, how dare you say that the whole purpose of God is to just get is to be that sort of end goal for us. Rather, God doesn't need us. God is absolutely different from us. He is the creator, and he is the teacher. We are the student. He is the teacher, and this is interesting why he is the teacher-student sort of role here, because weirdly enough, you might view Hegel's sort of ideas like you want to gain knowledge from the teacher who is ultimately God. But for Kierkegaard, this teacher-student relation actually is that it isn't God who, it isn't in a way, the teacher doesn't need the student to exist, but rather the teacher, out of love, as he describes in the parable of the king and the princess, where the king wants the princess to freely choose to love him rather than to be coerced despite his almighty power, where the teacher effectively moves the student from untruth to truth through his own will, through his own teaching, and ultimately through the absolute paradox of Christ's incarnation. And so, despite these questions being actually quite different, but they all come together in philosophical fragments where Kierkegaard wants to attack Hegel for saying that God is, in a way, the ultimate end of us as a species, and therefore, in a way, you can say the converse, that humans are the ultimate end for God. That once we fully know him, everything's sorted. Kierkegaard wants to say, no, things aren't straightforward, is that there's an absolute paradox of Jesus Christ's incarnation, and there is a student-teacher relation where the teacher brings the student through absolute paradox from untruth to truth. And Johannes Climacus' major point here is that, in a way, he very much, and this is why like anti-Hegelian is an interesting term, because he very much wants to use the sort of structures that Hegel, and the words, the language that he makes, dialectics. He wants to understand this idea of knowledge, this idea of reason, this idea of growing further from image towards reality, untruth to truth. And he wants to sort of use that structure and turn it on its head to disagree with a lot of Hegel's conclusions. And that's what Climacus is Johannes Climacus really is really delving into, and ultimately in the end he concludes this is true Christ, this is true the absolute paradox. God has become man, and man can now learn who is God.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that explanation. I think it's a good place to end off this Existentialist Talks podcast. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for this fortnightly episode. The next episode, we will hopefully, if everything goes well, be fishing while we're talking about existentialism. The Existential Fish podcast is the next evolution of this podcast. But have a great one. Stay safe. See you soon. Thank you for watching, and God bless. I'll see you next one.